Thank you very much, Larry. It's my privilege and challenge today to introduce to all of you a man who needs no introduction, but rest assured I will introduce him anyway. When I think of Jim Wilson, I think of how we invariably referred to him when I was working at the Wall Street Journal editorial page. You know, when I first started working there, I actually thought that Jim's official title was the best social scientist in America. Of course, you have to be careful how you abbreviate that title. Don't shorten it, for example, to best scientist, which would give you, obviously, BS. Nothing could be more unjust, in fact, because there is less BS in Jim Wilson's work than in the work of just about any other social scientist I've ever read. At first, one might think that calling Jim the best social scientist in America is just hyperbole, and I'm afraid it's the kind of thing that would probably make Professor Wilson, a modest and self-effacing man, uncomfortable. It is not, of course, a claim that can be officially verified, and no doubt it can give rise to its share of after-hour debates at academic conventions, just as sports fans will spend hours debating who's the best quarterback in the NFL or the best pitcher in baseball. But I submit a good case can certainly be made on Jim Wilson's behalf. This was, after all, a man who taught for 26 years at Harvard's government department before returning to his native California to teach at UCLA and Pepperdine. A man who has written a raft of influential books on subjects like crime, bureaucracy, marriage, and morality. A man who has served as president of the American Political Science Association and won its Lifetime Achievement Award. A man who has served on presidential commissions ranging from Lyndon Johnson's Task Force on Crime to George W. Bush's Task Force on Bioethics. A man who's received 7 honorary degrees, including one from Harvard. Oh, and of course he's also received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor an American can win. The one award that has escaped his grasp is the Nobel Prize, and I assume that's simply because there's no category for social science outside of economics. By any standard, Jim Wilson has had a career of unparalleled distinction. But I'd say his best claim to the title of best social scientist in America is simply this. He managed to spend more than a quarter of a century on Harvard's faculty, and yet he never lost his innate common sense. Or perhaps I should say, in deference to one of his book titles, his moral sense. Anyone familiar with the nonsensical notions that emanate from the faculty of our elite universities will recognize what a staggering achievement that truly is. I think we all remember Bill Buckley's famous quip about how he'd rather be ruled by the first 2,000 names in the Boston phone directory than by the faculty of Harvard. Clearly, when he said that, he did not have Jim Wilson in mind. Now, Jim's career has been marked by serious engagement with the major public policy issues of our time. He has invariably eschewed academic and political fads in favor of searching, scholarly examination. While a conservative by politics and inclination, he is no partisan ideologue. Rather, he is an honest scholar who lets the facts lead him where they may. And when he has examined controversial issues like marriage and morality, the evidence has led him in a decidedly traditionalist direction. He argues, for example, that the moral sense is a fragile thing and that it needs to be nurtured in a 2-parent family. He also argues that while we can't figure out exactly what causes crime, we can deal with its consequences by locking up offenders. Now, I realize this may not come as news to your local Kiwanis Club, but it is nothing less than earth-shattering to have such truths affirmed at a place like Harvard University. And Jim Wilson has performed a real public service by defending traditional notions of right and wrong within the framework of modern social science. As I'm sure all of you know, Jim has made his biggest contribution as a criminologist, as the co-author, among other things, of the famous article with George Kelling in the Atlantic Monthly in 1992 called Broken Windows, the article that first made the then controversial argument that in order to make cities livable, police forces had to tackle not just big crimes like rape and murder, but little ones like panhandling, graffiti, and fair jumping, and so many others. All too many academics have made our lives appreciably worse by spouting all sorts of dangerous nonsense. Jim Wilson is one of the few who has made our lives much, much better by laying the intellectual foundations for Mayor Giuliani's crackdown on crime in New York City. And I say to all of you, if you seek Jim Wilson's memorial, dear audience members, look around you to the safe streets of New York. Jim is now officially retired and living in Malibu, where he can devote more time to things like scuba diving. But even in retirement, he has not given up on hard intellectual labor. Today, he is here to speak about one of the most important topics in the world, the question of whether Muslim nations can become democratic. Though Jim was primarily known for his work on domestic policy, he also served as a member of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board during the Reagan administration. And more recently, he has written for City Journal and other publications on the very theme that he will address today. I am sure that President Bush and Senator Kerry will address the very same subject tonight, but I doubt they will do it half as intelligently as our lunchtime speaker. I give you now the best social scientist in America, Jim Wilson.
Thank you very much, Max. Max was for a while at the Wall Street Journal what Norman Podhoretz was at Commentary, an unindicted co-conspirator. The great majority of pieces I wrote for those two publications were written because either Max at the Journal or Norman at Commentary called me up and said, you had to write this. But I's name appears at the top, so if there are mistakes, the mistakes are my fault. Can liberal societies exist in predominantly Muslim nations? That is a very good question. But notice I am asking about liberal societies, not about democratic ones. Liberalism, defined as a decent respect for the freedom of others, is essential to human progress. It permits scientific invention, business entrepreneurship, literary and philosophical imagination, and skill at all manner of enterprises. Liberalism, however, ultimately depends upon democracy, for no state that begins along a liberal path by removing the boot of the oppressor from the neck of the people will long remain that way unless the people have an organized, systematic, and regular way of replacing one set of leaders with another. Now, the question I am asking today has already been asked by a number of people, both on the political left and the political right. Some remarks from the political left say that by invading Iraq, we are practicing, quote, gunboat democracy, unquote. Another said the prospects for democracy there were, quote, a fantasy, unquote. Still another said that the best we can do would be to stimulate in those places demagogic politicians who would be more than ever profoundly anti-American. George Will, an old friend, recently suggested that the prospects for democracy in Iraq are not good because it lacks both democratic citizens and a democratic culture. And even worse than those two lacks, he went on to point out that there is no one in Iraq that quite has the standing of George Washington, James Madison, or John Marshall. He thought that the prospects for democracy in Iraq were about akin to the prospects of Alexander Kerensky continuing to rule Russia after Lenin arrived at the Finland station. Now, there are good reasons for pessimism on this matter. Between the time England signed the Magna Carta in 1215 and 3 centuries later, ministers were still being burned at the stake. And it was not until 2 centuries after that that the King of England signed, under duress, a Toleration Act, which, though it did not emancipate Catholics and Jews, it did at least permit them to exist. It was not until the middle of the 19th century that you could matriculate at Oxford or Cambridge without signing the 39 Articles. The United States had a better start on democracy than other countries because we inherited some of its principles from England. But after a century, we had to fight a bitter civil war with no planned outcome in sight, in order initially to save the Union and then later, and more importantly, to end slavery. Liberal regimes have until recently been relatively more common than democratic ones. In 1914, in Europe, there were only 3 democracies, and if you insisted on living in a democracy, your choices would have been very small. But if you insisted on living at least in a country where the boot of the oppressor would not be on your neck, you might have chosen, well, perhaps not Germany, but possibly Belgium or Holland or Luxembourg or Norway or Sweden. Few of these at any time could have been called a democracy then, but they were tolerable places to live. There have only ever been 3 democracies in the Middle East: Israel, Lebanon, and Turkey. Israel is still a democracy, though one besieged on all sides by determined enemies seeking to destroy the country. Turkey has managed to become more of a democracy since 1923, but it has taken 80 years to achieve this gain. Lebanon, briefly in the 1950s, was an open and liberal society, the Paris of the East, with a tolerant, open, friendly place, with Beirut being an exciting city. But after this brief flirt with openness, disaster fell. When the Palestinians invaded the South, civil war broke out, Syria invaded Lebanon, and now Syria largely controls it. But the Middle East is not the only place where Muslim nations exist. They exist all across North Africa, and they exist in Southeast Asia, particularly in countries such as Indonesia. And therefore, what I would like to do today is to talk about 3 countries in which democracy has made some progress, more in some, less than in others. I'd like to talk about Indonesia, Morocco, and Turkey. And from this brief exercise in condensed comparative politics, try to draw out some lessons that may possibly be applicable to what we hope we see developing in Afghanistan and Iraq. Indonesia. It has taken nearly a half century to move from national independence, which was acquired in 1849, to the first free presidential elections, which occurred this month in the year 2004. The first president after independence was Sukarno. He established a regime called guided democracy, which was mostly guidance and very little democracy. In 1963, he had himself proclaimed president for life, but alas for his prognosticating skills, his presidency lasted only 2 years, though his life lasted much longer. His problems arose from the fact of the rising power of the Indian Communist Party, his decision to withdraw Indonesia from the United Nations, and his tendency to allow economic progress to slip. As a result, the Indonesian military removed Sukarno from power and put in power the head of the military, Suharto, who then became president and was reelected for, as I recall, over 30 years. He was reelected not by the people, but by a consultative assembly, an organization packed with his hand-picked supporters. He was never opposed in any of these reelection campaigns, and for 32 years he guided Indonesia on what turned out to be, for many years, a route of sustained economic progress. The gross domestic product in Indonesia grew at the rate of about 7% a year during most of his time, but like many rulers who stay in office too long, he began to get sloppy with the handles of power. He established a practice which I suppose we could call crony capitalism. His son was given a tax-exempt company on condition that he would produce an Indonesian car. Well, he did produce a car. Unfortunately, it was manufactured in South Korea, and pocketed a lot of money in the process. When a severe financial crisis finally caught up with Indonesia during the great Asian monetary meltdown of 1997, Suharto could not survive, and he resigned as president. He made his hand-picked successor vice president. Now, at this point, anyone who wants to predict the future will say, well, more of the same. The hand-picked successor, obviously, will pick up the reins of power, make a few changes, and go on behaving as Suharto had before him. No. Mr. Habibie succeeded in persuading the legislature to pass a wildly liberal election law, a law that called for direct popular elections for both the parliament and for the president, that banned civil servants and seated military officers from serving, that imposed some version of campaign finance rules, and limited each president to 2 consecutive 5-year terms. Well, following this completely unpredicted and dramatic change in the politics of Indonesia, elections were held for the new assembly. One party headed by a moderate Muslim named Gus Dur. I will not give you the full Indonesian names. Happily, even in Indonesia, they give abbreviations. His full name is Abadur Anwadi, but he was known as Gus Dur, who, though the leader of a vast Muslim social organization, was a moderate and insisted that religion should not govern politics. The other party was headed by Mega, Mega Kawati Sukarno-Porto, who was the daughter of President Sukarno. She lost in the election, and Gus Dur became president. He tried to continue building the Indonesian economy, but he was a frail man. He suffered a stroke. There were many problems, and so the legislature impeached him, making Mega the president. She had been the vice president before that. She had her own problems: corrupt Indonesian police, continuing violence in the Indonesian part of Papua New Guinea, continuing violence in many other locations, jihad extremists, many of them trained in the equivalent of the madrasas you find in Pakistan, sought to gain power. But she had been democratically elected and served out her term. And then this year, a new set of elections were held. In the legislative elections, Mega's party lost power. And it was clear that unless something dramatic happened, she would lose the presidency. A few months later, the presidential elections were held. They were concluded just about a week or so ago. And a man, again, I will give you his nickname, not his full name, SBY, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, became president directly elected by the overwhelming majority of the people. And at this point, after 80 years of effort, Indonesia had become a reasonably democratic nation. Next, Morocco. Morocco had existed for centuries as an Arab and Berber state in North Africa. And then, of course, it was occupied by the French for 44 years, including time under the Vichy regime. And you'll all remember the Vichy regime because we all saw the movie Casablanca at least 7 times. Inside and outside of Rick's Cafe, the corrupt Vichy officials more or less tried to keep Morocco under control, depending on who was sent south to manage it. Sometimes the French said good managers, usually they sent rather bad ones. But France, at the end of the Second World War, had a major problem. It controlled 3 colonies in northern Africa, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. It was clear that independence movements were developing in all 3 countries. So it had to make a decision. Which one would it fight to keep? And it decided to set Tunisia and Morocco free and fight in Algeria, where over 1 million Frenchmen had taken over most of the arable land. It was a classically bad French decision. They lost Algeria in one of the most bloodthirsty, desperate wars known. Over 100,000 French soldiers were killed. Over 1 million Algerians were killed. And only by electing Charles de Gaulle president were they able, slowly and over the opposition of secret army organizations, to extract the French from Algeria. This led Morocco free, and the former caliph became known as King Mohammed V. King Mohammed V, that's a rare title in the Muslim world because it suggests, in this case it directly implied, that the king was not only the head of the state, he was the direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. He ruled for a few years and then died, and his son Hassan II became King Hassan. He also argued that he was the direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, thereby trying to unite in one person both secular and religious authority. He was widely regarded at the time he took office as the errant playboy son of a rather pleasant father. They predicted he would last 6 months in office. Instead, he lasted for 38 years. During this time, he survived 2 army coups, the opposition of a radical Muslim fundamentalists, a political left-wing revolution, and the hostility of Algeria and Libya, both of whose countries gave some degree of support to terrorists operating in the Western Sahara. During this turmoil, he maintained the notion of constitutional monarchy, which was in fact more monarchical than constitutional, as you can be told by the fact that every time he submitted a new constitution to be ratified to the people, and he submitted 5 during his career, each one was supported by over 95% of the vote. Only in the Soviet Union do you get that kind of turnout. But each constitution increasingly broadened the rights of people and slowly made it possible for others to vote, increased the opportunities for women, During this time, he engaged in secret negotiations with the Israeli state, and in 1986 openly and publicly welcomed Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres to Rabat for a public celebration. This notion of Hassanian democracy, constitutional monarchy with the emphasis on the monarch, persisted for a long time. The legislature existed, but under any kind of emergency, the king could rule by royal decree, and he did rule by royal decree. And a law was passed under the Constitution which made it a crime to publish anything about the king that the king deemed offensive to him. Now, these are the beginnings over now 40 years of what was later to emerge to be the slow beginnings of a democratic state in Morocco. Security improved. Radical Islamicists were contained. Many were exiled. The king once remarked that true Islam is tolerant because tolerance is the touchstone of civilization. Political freedoms were slowly expanded, especially in the 1990s, in part because the king sought membership in the European Union, and in part because he wanted to borrow money from the United States, two things that tend to sharpen the focus of any ruler in North Africa. The fifth constitution, passed in 1996, led to a generally free election with no party gaining the majority of the legislature, 16 parties running candidates, opposition parties and government parties contesting. King Hassan died unexpectedly in 1999, and his son became King Mohammed VI. Now, his son was even more liberal. He had been educated at Georgetown University. He had inherited from his father a legacy of stability, and he wanted to add to that legacy of stability a new tradition of political change and progress. So he supported economic liberalization and human rights. He allowed Amnesty International and the Human Rights Commission to open offices in Rabat. He gave amnesty to thousands of prisoners. He fired the much-detested Minister of Interior, who had been responsible for locking many people up without trials, and began to create what was generally a free and fair state. Then, last year, there were Islamic extremists who produced suicide bombings in Casablanca. The king responded by arresting all of them, saying that the country would never accept that Islam could have anything to do with satisfying its ambitions to rule in the name of religion. This produced shocks of horror from Amnesty International. This is the same organization that thinks the United States is not free because we have the death penalty. But these events did not materially alter the changes he had brought about. In the 2002 elections, created a governing coalition composed of socialist and conservative parties, an opposition led by a relatively modest Islamist party. The rights of women were expanded. Freedom House has issued a report documenting how many more women were entering parliament and important entrepreneurial and educational institutions. Lastly, Turkey. I've spoken to this audience before about Turkey, and I will say more briefly some of the same things I said on that case. Turkey was created in 1923 by Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, the father of Turkey. He was responding to the problem that lies at the heart of Muslim civilization. For many centuries, Muslim civilization was the greatest, most dominant civilization in the world. It had produced art and architecture, literature and philosophy. It managed incredible libraries. Its military was victorious on practically every front. And so it lasted until the invention of science. And then it was expelled from Spain, defeated twice at the gates of Vienna, retreated home, and began to fall apart under the rather uncaring administration of the Ottoman Empire. Ataturk, like many other Muslim leaders, could have responded to this by saying, we will fight back by buying Western arms and Western machinery. But that was not Ataturk's view. Ataturk said, we will buy nothing. We will become Western, because at the heart of the West is the open mind and the possibility of scientific, commercial, and military innovation. And unless we become Western in every sense, we cannot participate in scientific and military and commercial innovation. Ataturk once said, "For everything in the world, for civilization, for life, for success, the truest guide is knowledge and science." Later, when he was speaking privately to a person who later published the remarks, he said, "I have no religion at all, and at times I wish all religions at the bottom of the sea. But," he said, "my people, though they must avoid superstition and learn the principles of democracy, must nonetheless have some institutions around which they can rally." So he did not suppress the Muslim church, he simply put it under government control. He established a public school system, abolished religious courts, got rid of the caliph, legalized the sale of alcohol, made compulsory the use of Latin rather than Arabic as the language of Turkey, adopted a German commercial code and a Swiss business code, allowed a Turkish woman to run for beauty queen, and perhaps in his most revealing decision, took the great mosque at Santa Sophia and turned it into a museum. He favored democracy in principle, but alas, in his lifetime, he did not favor it in practice. His followers dominated the government. When someone pointed out that for it to be a democratic government, there ought to be an opposition party, Ataturk said, "Well, there will be an opposition party. I will pick its name and I will select its leaders." And therefore, it is now an opposition party. When there were rebels against his rule, he passed tough laws and cracked down on them. A maintenance of order law was passed in 1925 that gave the government the right to close down any organization or newspaper it deemed subversive. Then he died, and slowly the practice of democracy began to rise to match the promise of the principle of democracy. Elections were held, free parties were formed, contests were engaged in, and newly elected leaders began to assume power. The military, still very much under the influence of the legacy of Ataturk, intervened to protect Ataturk's secularism. It intervened in politics in 1960, 1971, 1980, and 1998. And it intervened against all manner of regimes. In 1960, it staged a coup against a dictatorial right-wing government. In 1971, against a center-right government. In 1980, against a liberal government. And in 1997, against an Islamic government. But after each intervention, the military, once they were assured that law and order was being maintained, would return to their barracks and never ask to rule the country. The fact that the military can do this, of course, has remained for many decades the reason why Turkey has found it difficult to get into the European Union. But the important lesson is not their admission to the Union. Their important lesson is that the military thought of itself as enforcing Ataturk's principles, not governing in Ataturk's place. In 2002, the first party with an openly pro-Islamic leader won an election. He was not displaced by the military. A man later became the prime minister of this party after Congress passed a bill discharging him from prison where he had once been held for having allegedly incited religious hatred. And now he is the prime minister of Turkey, and by a narrow vote lost his bid to allow the American 4th Infantry Division to invade Iraq through Turkey. Turkey, in short, is slowly becoming more and more democratic. There are other Muslim countries you could put on this list. Mali and Senegal, for example, are reasonably democratic, though predominantly Muslim and deeply poor. They nonetheless have a tradition which can only be understood in their culture that permits other regimes, other parties to exist and keeps the foot of the governor off the necks of the oppressed. Kuwait has expanded personal freedom slightly. Pakistan has expanded press freedom enough so that, in the opinion of those who survey these matters, Pakistan now ranks only slightly behind India in the degree of press freedom. All right, end of lecture on comparative politics. Now, what lessons can I draw from this? I'd like to draw four. First, the role of religion. Secondly, the role of the West. Thirdly, ethnic divisions. And finally, the role of the United States. The first thing you see about these countries is the extent to which they have managed to divorce politics from religion. They have made politics either entirely secular, as in Turkey. They have constrained Muslim leaders, as has done Indonesia. Or they have, as in the case of Morocco, a leader who personifies both the religious and the secular tradition, but allows the secular tradition to dominate. Similar leaders have not arisen in most other Middle Eastern countries. Separating from religion from politics was absolutely central to the emergence of freedom. You cannot expect that people will pursue their own ambitions and destinies if they must at every stage in their life be worried that the government will insist that they act in a way that conforms to religious doctrine. Now, this change, it seems to me, has made it possible for the military to become the enforcers of secular rule. They are clearly that in Turkey. They have been that on occasion in Morocco, and they have been that in Indonesia. In those Muslim countries, even those not headed by theocratic rulers, such as Egypt, for example, or Syria, the military intervenes and rules the country. It does not retreat. It is not there simply to prevent the emergence of religious authority. Second, it's important to notice the great impact the West has begun to have on Islam. Socialism was the first impact. It was tried by Sukarno in Indonesia and by Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia, and of course it was a disaster. And so that was then set aside in favor of fascism as it was practiced in Syria and Iraq. And Iraqi's fascism ended until the American occupation was successful. Today the question is whether another liberal Western idea, that is to say the idea of a liberal democracy, will take its place. It has taken root in Turkey. It has had influence in Morocco and Indonesia. It is gaining influence every day in Afghanistan. But unfortunately, in most Muslim countries, the chief rival to the discredited Western regimes of the past is not democracy, it is radical Islam. It's not hard to see why. Islam is organized into mosques, many of which support charitable and educational organizations, institutions that, how to put this, provide services that reach so deep into the country that political opposition gathers around these institutions the way salt crystallizes around a string that is left hanging in salt water. In the West, the Protestant Reformation set in motion, though it did not achieve, religious freedom. But nothing quite like that can occur in a Muslim nation. In those places, there is neither a pope nor a priesthood against whom one can rebel. The mosques, after all, are not churches in a Catholic sense. That is to say, they are not holy places and they do not dispense sacraments. Mosques are simply meeting places where one prays. It is hard to imagine there will ever be a Muslim Martin Luther King or a Muslim John Calvin who, by embracing a rival faith, can create a process of religious separation which in time, over 2 or 3 centuries, will lead prudent rulers to practice religious toleration as the only viable way of surviving amidst religious differences. This fact should not surprise us. Political freedom emerged in England out of a centuries-long struggle between the monarch's church and its religious opponents. It may take a long time for this to happen in Muslim nations, but it took a very long time for it to happen in our nation. Third, these countries have in common the fact that there are no profound ethnic differences. To be sure, there are Kurds in Turkey, but they are in the southern eastern frontier area, and they at present constitute no threat to the regime. Turkey watches them closely, but does not believe apparently that continuous harassment is important. Morocco is divided loosely between Arabs and Berbers, but increasingly the distinction between an Arab and Berber is much less important than the distinction between people who live in cities and people who live in the countryside. Indonesia has no ethnic differences other than the Hindu-speaking island of Bali, where they practice a certain kind of private happiness, which has, as near as I can tell, no religious implications at all. But now imagine the other countries. Pakistan is divided between Sunnis and Shiites. Iraq is divided between Sunnis and Shiites. Lebanon is divided between Sunnis and Shiites. The presence of this profound religious difference, a religious difference whose origin historically is so small it requires an electron microscope to detect it, who namely was the legitimate successor to the Prophet Muhammad, has profoundly changed the politics of those countries. Iraq's border was created by French mapmakers after the First World War. It was created at a time when, as Margaret Macmillan put it in her recent book on the Paris Peace Conference, said there was no Iraqi people. There was no Iraqi nationalism. There was only an Arab existence. Its population in Iraq was divided, she said, with Basra oriented toward India, Baghdad toward Persia, and Mosul toward Turkey. Creating a nation there is akin to creating a nation in Yugoslavia after the Second World War. Only Tito was able to do it. Twice the British government tried to bring a government to Iraq, and both times it failed. In the 1920s, it occupied the country, but when that became too costly, it withdrew. They left behind a constitution that empowered King Faisal, but King Faisal was not very skillful. His son could not manage affairs, and so the country splintered along ethnic lines, with the army ultimately seizing power. When the Second War was beginning, the British Army once again occupied Iraq in order to prevent Iraq from forming an alliance with Hitler, and in order to make sure that Iraq would not create a barrier between Britain to the west and its colony, India, to the east. Once again, it stayed for a few years. Once again, it left in part a government. Once again, the government collapsed. Now, in view of this history of Iraq, set aside the long, slow, painful, but quite meaningful gains in countries that I've held up as emerging liberal democracies, just how optimistic should we be? Well, political scientists should never make predictions, but I will give you the facts as I see them. A recent opinion poll taken just a few months ago shows that at least verbally the Iraqi people support liberal and democratic government, but especially a liberal one. About 40% want multi-party democracy such as that found in most European nations. Only one-third as many as that say they would prefer a theocracy of the sort that was found in Iran. But of course those opinions differ across the regions of the country. In the Shiite areas, they like multi-party democracy. In the Sunni areas, they like theocracy. But their support for liberalism, that is to say their support for freedom, is even stronger. 90% want free speech. 3/4 want freedom of religion. 3/4 favor free assembly. Freedom in Iraq today is more popular than democracy. A matter which might have well been true in England and America 4 centuries ago, but we didn't have the public opinion polls that would test it. There may be a lesson for us here. Scholars at the Rand Corporation have published a book in which they have studied American efforts to build nations following wars, beginning with Germany and Japan and going through Haiti and Somalia and Afghanistan and Bosnia and Kosovo. They draw many lessons from this analysis. One lesson they draw that is especially clear to me is that you never know in advance whether or not you will succeed. The fog of war, as Clausewitz put it, does not end simply with the ending of war. The fog of war continues in the post-war period, where people struggle and then usually realize only as an afterthought what might have been done better. But it is very difficult in advance to know what should be done better. One lesson does appear, and the authors of the Rand report put it in this language. While staying long does not guarantee success, leaving early ensures failure. it would be an unmitigated disaster to leave Iraq too early. Our Iraq supporters would be crushed. Islamic radicals would have won. The chance for using Iraq as a way of developing freedom in the Middle East would be gone. I'm not sure what leaving too early means. We stayed for decades in Germany and decades in Japan. We stayed initially for 18 months in Bosnia. We've now been there for 10 years. In the countries where we have been conspicuously failing as the builders of new nations, Haiti and Somalia, we left very quickly. And now, of course, we seem reluctant, or the larger world seems reluctant, even to enter the Sudan. I believe the road ahead in Iraq will be a bumpy one. The outcome will hinge on people and circumstances whose existence we cannot now foresee, just as the post-war period hinged on results no one could have predicted. We prepared for all of the oil wells being set on fire. They weren't. We predicted mass emigration out of the country. It didn't happen. We predicted street-to-street fighting to defeat the Iraqi army. It didn't happen. And those were the best predictions people in the Pentagon and the State Department could make. What should we predict for the future? We can't say. But it seems to me that a remarkably skilled and powerful leader who can somehow contain ethnic conflict and a powerful army devoted to secular rule can make, over a long period of time, Iraq all that we hope it will be. I am cautiously optimistic that this will happen if we stay the course. It will not happen if we say we're going to start withdrawing troops in a year and we'll withdraw all of them within 4 years. That is a recipe for failure. If we do this, Iraq fails and our hopes will be crushed. Thank you.
Professor Wilson will take questions. I ask you, once he acknowledges you, please wait for the microphone. It's a big room, and we all want to hear your question. All right?
This morning's Wall Street Journal has an excellent piece reviewing the debate in the Muslim community on the policy of taking hostages and having beheadings as a tactic, and the refusal generally to condemn it. What does that say about their definition of liberality as opposed to ours?
Well, taking and beheading hostages is the very opposite of liberality, as you and I both know, Heather. The question is how widespread are those feelings? It's hard to say. In this world, many people, even those who do not engage in beheadings, will think that somewhere in the Quran or somewhere in the Hadith, there are statements about beheading your enemies, and they will take misguided comfort from it. The task, of course, is to make it very difficult to capture people and kidnap them, and very costly to behead them. And that is the struggle that is now going on. They are attempting to behead those people in order to change the American and the Iraqi election. We can't let them succeed.
CIA, and so forth. What could we have done and what should we do now, besides all of us learning to speak Arabic?
I spent 6 years on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board struggling with this question. Needless to say, since it was a secret board, most of its reports appeared the next day on the front pages of the Washington Post. But I still am cautious about some things. But let me say this. Leading up to the Iraqi war, the CIA station in charge of Iraq was located in Munich, Germany. Munich. The best we could do, I hope this is not stating it too strongly, was to hope that some Mossad operatives reporting back through Jerusalem would let us know what they think had happened. We do not have, in my view, better assets in Iran today. Why is that? We have downgraded, beginning with Admiral Thomas Stansfield in the Carter administration, and continuing until it was recently reversed, our efforts to put in place human intelligence. Now, I will give one point to the opposition. Putting human intelligence in place in a country where you do not have an active embassy is very difficult because you cannot give them governmental cover. Governmental cover means you're the second secretary of the American embassy. Everybody knows you're an American officer. But it does mean if you're arrested, all they can do to you is declare you persona non grata. If you have non-governmental cover, if you're a mechanic or a carpenter or a plumber or a small businessman, you don't have government cover. So if you're caught, you will be executed, often very painfully. So this is the problem for American intelligence. How does it build up its intelligence capabilities precisely in those countries where being in an embassy is of very little importance and being out in the field is of very great importance? I do not know how this problem will be managed in Iraq. I suspect that American officers working with an effort to create some comparable agency in Iraq are trying to do it now. But having seen the agency over many, many years, I'm not wildly optimistic that we'll be very successful.
Not to abuse my privilege to speak too much, but one question that comes to my mind listening to your remarks, Jim, is, I mean, you're talking about democracy in Muslim countries, which are non-Arab countries, in places like Turkey or Indonesia. You can add Malaysia and Bangladesh.
Right.
Now, the question that arises is there something in Arab culture which prevents the emergence of a similar sort of democracy in those places? Because clearly we have examples of Muslim democracies. We don't have a single example of an Arab democracy. And is there an obstacle within the Arab world as opposed to within Islam itself that makes that more difficult to emerge?
I will give you my speculation on that, Max. You're quite true. Where I mentioned Muslim democracies, I was talking about non-Arabic but Muslim countries. There is not a single democracy that is a member of the Arab League. Why is that? I can repeat only what Bernard Lewis has said, and I think very eloquently. The Arab movement took religion, Muslim faith, and made it a calling and a cause, and did not use that faith as a way of establishing national boundaries. Whereas when Constantine was converted to Christianity and decided to convert the rest of us to Christianity, sometimes at the point of a sword, he was dealing not only with nation states but principalities and dukedoms. And in time, the existence of these political boundaries meant that religious conflict had to be managed in order to permit rulers to survive. The Arab world has never created nations. Saudi Arabia was created in the 1920s with uncertain boundaries. Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Lebanon were created by French and British mapmakers after the First World War. Egypt, I think you could say, is an Arab country that had its own national boundaries, but I believe it's probably the only one. I think that the failure to have, as part of the Arab historical culture, clear national boundaries that have long-term meaning for people has made it difficult for them to organize a political rule of any sort, democratic or otherwise. That may be an inadequate answer, but it is the best I can do on the spur of the moment. We'll get to you in a second. Come ahead. All the way up here.
You mentioned a prerequisite going forward in Iraq is an army devoted to secular rule.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. Roughly, how big an army, and what are the chances of getting that size?
How big an army do we need in Iraq? I have no idea.
Of Iraqis.
Of Iraqis? I have no idea. I'm a social scientist. I'm not a military strategist. I mean, you could say, well, we had 10 million people in Germany, and you could divide that by the number of people in Germany and say we need an army of that size per capita to do the rule. But Germany was not at a different place from Iraq. It had a more or less established bureaucracy. Once we engaged in some form of denazification, postmasters and passport clerks and tax collectors stepped forward and began doing their job in time. In fact, it was even possible to create a German army. None of these things exist in Iraq to quite the same degree. So I don't know how many soldiers you need, and my guess is there is no soldier who knows how many soldiers we need.
If you can ever figure out what presidential candidate Kerry wants to do in Iraq, do you have any viewpoint of what might happen if he gets elected?
I think the election of President Kerry, unless he profoundly changes his remarks over the next 33 days, would be a disaster. He has said that he wants to start pulling out American troops in a year and have them all out in 4 years. That is a message to the Iraqi radicals that they only have to last for another year or 4 years and they will win. And it is a message to Alawi's government that if they wish to persevere, they must now assemble a tyrannical army and force by brute strength their power on these people who they know are out to get them. I disagree with President Bush about a lot of issues. I'm not here as a partisan of his campaign, though happily I wear a medal he gave me. But I think on one issue he is supremely correct. We stay the course. It is the central lesson. We stay the course and we give no hint of when we would leave. And by giving no hint, we give no signal that because the signal is heard, people know in advance how to behave. Lady right over here, please.
Do you think that the fact that there's been an educated female population in Iraq since the 1920s could make for a more optimistic outcome?
Well, there's no doubt that a more educated female population would be an advantage. If we were educated at the level of men, it would double the size of the workforce. And it seems to me that moving in that direction is very important. You have to remember that Muhammad's first wife was a rich female businesswoman, and she funded his activities. He then married again, and then he married again, and finally announced that no man should have more than 4 wives. Well, for much of the Arab world, that was a gain, because some had 8. But the notion that female subordination lies at the heart of Muslim rule, I believe, is historically false. It has been added on now, since female subordination has also been part of the Western tradition, beginning with the medieval tradition that women were sexually adventurous as souls that would take advantage of helpless men. I can understand how both traditions moved in this direction. But we've more or less got over it, and I trust they will more or less get over it as well. I hope so. In Morocco, they have, and in Indonesia, they have. The president of the country was a female. Peter Flanagan, right down here, please.
Norman Horowitz, who had asked this question for himself, has suggested that the Iraq War is only a battle in the greater war, which he calls World War IV, against the threat to Western civilization from Islam, whose basic beliefs are contrary to those that created Western civilization. Do you agree with that?
I'm not convinced that we're engaged in a war against Islamic civilization, because there are too many Islamic countries where we have excellent relations, as we do in Morocco and Indonesia, as we do in Tunisia, another highly secular state, which, though Islamic in all cases, keeps religion in a subordinate role. I think the great sense in which we are engaged in World War IV is to alter the map of the Middle East, to make it clear that Israel will not remain there alone and isolated as the only democratic regime, that it will look over its shoulder and find a slowly liberalizing Jordan, that will look over its shoulder and find Syria, which has been put under such intense economic and, if necessary, military pressure that it changes. It will look at Iraq and discover a reasonably liberal society. And in time, Iran, the greatest challenge of all. But if you abandon Iraq, you abandon Syria, you abandon Jordan, you abandon Iran, and in the long run, you will abandon Israel. So I think the war is a regional war. I'm not sure it's a world war. I don't think we have to fight in Bangladesh or Pakistan or Indonesia or Mali or Senegal or Tunisia, but I do think we have to fight in the Middle East, and I think winning that fight is the central challenge for American foreign policy. One more, yes, right here. I was calling on you, sir.
I don't know if you watched the president being interviewed on O'Reilly. He was asked what he would do about Iran were they to get nuclear capability, or what he would do about them stopping them. And he said, well, we have to negotiate. He said it about 3 different ways. But in the end, he said, when asked, what would you do if they were to, would you do anything to stop them? And he said, yes, meaning negotiations to most people, I think, would go out the window if they were actually to achieve it. Do you think that that's going to be his immediate problem after the election? And what would you say the American people will tolerate him to do about it?
I don't know what he intends to do. There is an important role for negotiation, but as professional diplomats like to say, all options must be left on the table, including a deep strike at any site of Iranian nuclear weapons. And the only interesting question is whether the United States or Israel carries it out. In the past, in Osirik, we allowed the Israelis to carry it out. I don't think we can call upon our friends there to assume all of these responsibilities. But I have no insight into these relationships. This is a very delicate problem. But the notion that Iran would have a nuclear-armed weapon that it could fire to Israel or other friendly countries is absolutely unacceptable. Negotiation with all options on the table, I suppose, is the right course of action. What the president means, I suspect, he did not tell Mr. O'Reilly. I hope he wasn't tell anybody.